My name is Lyon. I am chair of the Association for Children Damaged by Hormone Pregnancy Tests, and I've agreed today to give oral evidence on why we feel that there is a link between hormone pregnancy tests and adverse effects. Daniel Mason is here. Daniel is a patient representative for our members, and we'll be telling you today about his experience with living with the effects of a hormone pregnancy test.
So if I could just say very briefly that we've had informal meetings and a lot with patient groups, and thank you for arranging those meetings, which have been very informative and helpful to us. We're now in the next stage, which is the oral hearings, and this is your chance to put on the record your views, a statement you want, and we'd like to hear also from Daniel this morning. Just to say that we do see this much more as a conversation rather than just well, like a select committee, which is very robust. We're not into that. Just to say that we've only got just under 3/4 of an hour, so it's up to you to keep to time.
Okay.
So I hope that's all right. And I think this is another member of your team who has just come in. And Nicky, I wonder, once you've taken off your coat and sat down, whether you'd just quickly like to introduce yourself, because I think you're here as a patient representative. Is that right? Right, okay, well, I think we know that. Thanks very much. So, Mary, it's over to you to, however you'd like to do this, whether you'd like us to hear from Daniel and from Nicky first, or whether you'd like to make a statement first. What would you like to do?
My original intention was to make the statement first, but if it would help for you to listen to the patient representatives first,
please. Yes.
I really don't mind. Spoke to Daniel, and I'm sure Nicky would feel the same. They're willing to basically give their evidence whenever you feel it's appropriate, so I will leave the decision to you.
Right, okay. No, up to you. Why don't you start with your statement?
In that case, yes, if you don't mind, I will. Obviously, I've already introduced Daniel and Nicky, so you understand that they will be actually telling you their experiences. Our association was established in '78 when we first became aware of evidence linking an association between hormone pregnancy tests, congenital malformations, miscarriages and stillbirths. Exactly 40 years later, we're still fighting to prove the association between HPTs and adverse effects, and by that I mean the scientific association. Throughout the 40 years, the burden of proof has been placed on us. We are asked to provide the science to prove a causal association between HPTs and adverse effects. We feel this demand is both unethical and unrealistic, and it appears that even today, science negates the need to acknowledge medical ethics and moral responsibility. A phrase used repeatedly is, "It's all in the past and is not relevant today." Yet the components contained in Primodos are in medicines today, with no definitive proof of their safety. Is it all in the past and not relevant for parents in their 70s who are still full-time carers for their children now in their 40s and 50s? And is it all in the past for mothers, including me, who live with the constant guilt that we didn't question our trusted family doctor? Were our doctors even aware that the tablets they gave us were 40 times the strength of an oral contraceptive pill? And what about the children damaged by HPTs? Well, you can decide if it's all in the past and not relevant today after you've listened to Daniel and Nicky share their experience of living every single day with these life-changing effects. Is the Primodos campaign relevant today? Yes, it is. By failing to acknowledge and take action on the warnings of adverse effects with HPTs, the regulatory process was allowed to continue unchallenged when it was clearly not fit for purpose. Neither Shearing nor the regulator took action to protect the consumer by withdrawing the drug until further testing had been carried out. Instead, the Chief Medical Officer of the Committee on Safety of Medicines contacted Shearings, and I quote, "In an unofficial way, I want to warn them about his study which had revealed a 1 in 5 babies would be born with birth defects, which is an overall 20% risk. And if you take Primados in relation to normal abnormalities, it's 10 times more than the normal abnormalities." Dr. Inman said he wanted to give Shearings time to remove the drug from the market to avoid medical legal problems by taking action now. This was 6 months before the first government health warning was released to the medical community. In fact, documents show that Shearings assessed their own inactivity as potentially illegal by stating medical legally we would get into difficulties both as a company and as individuals. Today we have victims of sodium valproate and surgical mesh who would have been spared their agonising injuries if these failings had been acknowledged and a robust independent regulatory process implemented. A process where regulators would place the health of the consumer first by acknowledging, investigating and more importantly acting promptly on adverse reaction reports. Appropriate safety measures must prioritise consumer safety and not protection of the pharmaceutical industry. Sadly, the current failures indicated by surgical mesh and sodium valproate prove the regulatory process is still not fit for purpose today. The Hippocratic Oath, which is still relevant today, is the earliest documented expression of medical ethics and includes the requirement to prescribe only beneficial treatments and refrain from causing harm. Primados was not a beneficial treatment, it was a test. There was no therapeutic benefit when used as a pregnancy test, only associated risk and eventual harm. It is indisputable that the requirements at the heart of the ethical code in the Hippocratic Oath were completely disregarded. It is important to reference the Hippocratic Oath to highlight the ethical and moral failures by the regulator and Shearings, failures which have never been acknowledged or investigated. Instead, the focus remains firmly on proving the science. A further requirement of the review is to assess the historic evidence relating to the science and what was known in its lifetime, and whether there appears to be flaws in the gathering of that scientific evidence or questions over its independence or interpretation. Documents we have show that there were flaws in the gathering of historical scientific evidence and doubt about its independence and interpretation. The most recent example is the Expert Working Group Review, published in 2017. The group concluded there was no causal association, yet when measured against the WHO, World Health Organization, Uppsala paper on assessment of causality, evidence of a possible causality is clear. Measures contained in the assessment model is a positive association in animal studies which show malformations and embryonal lethality present. The Expert Working Group report state the combination of norethistrone and ethinyl estradiol showed consistent embryo lethality in different animal species. Evidence of malformations in Shearings' animal studies were also in the report. A second measure from Uppsala is a reasonable time relationship to drug intake. The report also states the likely window for HPT use covers most of the critical period of fetal development. Therefore, the first criterion for possible drug-related effects was considered met. Both these statements are from the 2017 group report, yet the group failed to acknowledge this evidence as proof of a causal association. Additional evidence of abnormalities and embryo lethality is contained in many animal experiments conducted by Shearing in the 1960s and 70s. These experiments show malformations and dying off of the majority of fetuses at doses close to the human equivalent. Once again, science is to be the focus of a review into failures by the regulator, not why many warnings were suppressed by the regulator, not why it took 5 years after removing the indication of pregnancy before the first government health warning was issued in 1975. A further warning issued in 1977 states, "Further results have now been published and the association is confirmed." Norway did take these warnings seriously and banned Primados in 1970, immediately followed by other European countries. The UK regulator did nothing. Instead, in February 1970, with, and I quote, "the approbation of the Government Chief Medical Officer Dr. Inman, Bayer Shearing discreetly withdrew the indication for use as a pregnancy test, but crucially did not inform anyone in the medical profession that the indication had been withdrawn." The review also asked whether the processes pursued when safety concerns were raised have been sufficient and satisfactory. I think it is apparent they were not. Measures to protect the consumer, including warning leaflets and withdrawal of the drug, were not pursued. Also asked is whether problems could have been recognised by the relevant bodies. Documents found in both Kew Archives and Landesarchiv Berlin prove that the problems were recognised, disregarded and suppressed. The Committee on Safety of Drugs was established in June 1963 and in 1964 incorporated the Metabolic Reactions Research Unit. These government agencies were established after the thalidomide tragedy specifically to ensure this could never happen again. One of the terms of reference for the research unit was to assemble and assess reports about adverse effects on drugs with the main objective to study mode of action on certain hormones. The hormones weren't specified. The first safety warning that we discovered, and I know that there were more, but this is the first one we discovered, about certain hormones was raised by Dr. Edwards in 1958, quickly followed by many documented warnings from scientists and members of the medical profession, culminating in the first scientific review published in the scientific journal Nature in 1967. The regulators once again did nothing except document their awareness of these warnings. They took no action to alert either the medical profession or the public until 17 years after the first after the first concerns were received and 8 years after the first in-depth study was published. Dr. Inman stated, "We have no excuse for the 8-year delay. I feel there was also no excuse for the 17 years of inaction after the first warning in 1958. There were 3,540 adverse effects reported on the yellow card system relating to ethinyl estradiol and norethindrone, which are the components of Primados. The MHRA acknowledged that the yellow card system is associated with an unknown level of underreporting. It's said to be about 10% of all reports that actually get sent through, which Dr. Inman also acknowledged and also stated the system was unfit to detect a teratogenic effect. The review asked if the same bodies could and should have acted upon concerns sooner, and if they did not, the reason why. The same bodies could and should have acted on concerns immediately the first warnings about its safety as a pregnancy test were received by the regulator. The reason why no action was taken is simple and contemptible. The regulator wanted to protect Shearing's oral contraceptive pill, which had the same components as Primados. The failure to act on these concerns also ensured protection of Shearing's total group sales of 2 billion Deutschmarks. In 1966, there were 3 deaths and 51 adverse reaction reports on oral contraceptives in 1 month. In 67, documents reveal there was a raised pregnancy wastage after using sex hormones of 16. The expected wastage, as it's quoted, was 7.5, more than double. In 67, Dr. Inman stated there is a definite relationship between oral contraceptives and deaths. 67, the annual report on Adverse Reaction Committee discussed the first study to show a definite risk between thromboembolism and OCs. The committee also established the risk increased by 10 times when using oral contraceptives. They further comment, studies from the Medical Research Council also confirm this causal relationship. An extract from Medical News dated October 67 contained details of a Mexican survey which found a much greater incidence of congenital defects in babies of women who had continued taking oral contraceptives when pregnant. The regulator's response to these warnings was, "We have not altered our view that there is no justification for the withdrawal of oral contraceptives, provided they are prescribed by doctors with the knowledge there is some risk. Yet, documents prove this risk was not disclosed to doctors until 1970. Exactly 50 years after the 1967 warnings, the current regulator concluded in the Expert Working Group report published in 2017, women should be reassured if they inadvertently become pregnant while taking these hormones for contraception. The documents containing the information on oral contraceptives were discovered in Kew archives, together with minutes from the Committee on Safety of Drugs, which stated a change to a lower dose could reduce the total deaths by 50%. The regulator felt the reports on congenital abnormalities and abortions linked to a pregnancy test with the same components as the oral contraceptive would cause panic amongst women who would stop taking the pill. It was feared that this would have a major effect on the world population, a fear shared by the World Health Organization, which is documented in the files. This fact is referenced in Dr. Inman's memoirs as part of the reason he decided not to withdraw Primados from the market. The review's term of reference will consider and take account of the historical context, including requirements of any regulatory or licensing regimes for medical devices and medicines in force at the appropriate time. These regulations and licensing regimes were in place at the appropriate time. In the 1968 Medicines Act, Section 28, Part 2, which states, action could be taken if the drug could no longer be regarded as a product which can safely be administered for the purpose indicated on the license, or can no longer be regarded as efficacious for that purpose. The Act also provided legislation for suspension of a drug with immediate effect if there were concerns about its safety. The Act was enforced in December 68 when the Subcommittee on Toxicity rejected an application from Shearing for a drug containing estradiol and norethindrone acetate, quote, since the possible benefits are considered to be significantly outweighed by known toxic hazards. The review asks about obtaining patient consent. Patient consent cannot be obtained if the patient is not fully informed of the risks and benefits associated with a drug, which is usually contained in a patient information leaflet. There were no patient information leaflets for the 25,000 packets of Primados dispensed from a drawer in the GP's surgery, or even when obtained on prescription from the chemist, the only information was how to take the tablets. The review asks whether problems could have been recognised by the manufacturer sooner and more effectively. Shearings had recognised and acknowledged the problems for many years, but effectively suppressed them with the help of our regulators and the German health agency, the BGA. Files in Landesarchiv Berlin contained almost 7,000 pages of evidence relating to the problems and concerns relayed to Shearings by both independent leading scientists and senior employees of their company. Documents which include a request to Shearings from an influential member of the BGA, the German Health Authority, to provide studies, again this is a quote, which do not show a statistically significant correlation between sex hormones in early pregnancy and deformities. He also said, I want to reassure you, we are advocates for Shearing. The review asks whether science is not broadly acknowledged or accepted, whether the available historic and scientific evidence can reasonably preclude a possible association between HPTs and teratogenic effects, or needs to be revisited. The available historic and scientific evidence cannot preclude a possible association. Proof of this is contained in an in-depth review of the science which proves an association between Primados and congenital malformations. not from the expert working group, who concluded after almost 2 years there was no causal association, but did not rule out a possible association. Not from the government's study by Dr. Poulter, who concluded if there was an association, it was only a weak one. Not even from the Commission on Human Medicines, who concluded there was no causal association, despite all epidemiological studies analysed by the group showing statistical significance in support of an association between hormones and birth defects. The independent review of the science, which does prove the association, was based on a review of all scientific evidence by Professor Carl Hennigan, a clinical epidemiologist and a leading expert in evidence-based medicine. I contacted Professor Hennigan after publication of the expert working group report, which I did not accept, and I did not either the conclusions or the recommendation. And I asked Professor Hennigan if he would review the evidence we had already provided to the expert working group. His response was quite clear. If he agreed to review the scientific evidence, he would publish his results whether they were good or bad for the association members. I accepted. The systematic review and meta-analysis completed by Professor Hennigan is a comprehensive assessment of historic and scientific evidence which concluded the use of an oral hormone pregnancy test in pregnancy is associated with increased risk of congenital malformations. The values for elevated risk in Professor Hennigan's analysis range from 40% for all malformations to 647 for the Vactal syndrome. I forwarded a copy of that report to each member of the expert working group, but I've yet to receive a response. We also have crucial new scientific evidence from Professor Neil Vargason, whose study using the components of primados on zebrafish revealed life-changing malformations similar to those suffered by our members. Zebrafish studies are widely acknowledged as the gateway for indications of harm to humans. Today, the results of Professor Vargason's study would preclude the drug's acceptance for use as an oral hormone pregnancy test. Taking into account the evidence relating to HPTs and of adverse effects and the availability of non-invasive alternative pregnancy tests, it seems inconceivable that no information or advice on these alternative tests was offered or even discussed. Inconceivable until you take into consideration the financial reward for Bayer shearing and the incentivisation to the GPs. Since the early 1960s, scientific evidence has been available from many independent studies, documents, correspondence, and scientific publication. This evidence was suppressed and in some instances destroyed. After Dr. Inman had destroyed the details of his study, he asked Shearing to subpoena him so he could discredit the results in a court of law. As a government employee, he was enabled to give evidence on behalf of Shearing without being subpoenaed and was desperate to distance himself from the findings of his study. This was particularly important when a bulletin from the World Health Organization referenced the study by Dr. Inman and concluded, quote, further evidence of an association between the use of HPTs and subsequent birth of a malformed child has been published. The review asks whether further action is now required, whether any forms of redress, and whether there is a moral, social, or ethical responsibility to consider a system of compensation. There is a moral, social, and ethical responsibility by both the government regulators and Bayer Shearing to provide redress to our members. Funds should also be made available to continue the research initiated by Professor Vargason into the safety of norethistrone acetate and ethinyl estradiol. These funds are essential for further research to protect future generations of women and our children. The children affected by hormone pregnancy tests should have funds provided which fully acknowledge the dreadful impacts HPTs have had on their lives, with provision for disability-related additional health costs and independent living. Our members already face an uncertain future with many cases of deteriorating health. There should be financial acknowledgement for parents for the years of guilt they still suffer watching their children cope with life-changing disabilities. Also parents whose children have their lives cut tragically short from the effects of these drugs. Funds should also be allocated to women who suffered abortion and loss of their newborn babies from the adverse effects of HPTs, and women who could not take the risk of another pregnancy after the birth of a deformed child. This is particularly cruel when they were categorically assured the deformity was not due to a HPT. The responsibility for the provision of the funds should be met by both the UK government and Bear Shearing. It should also be the responsibility of our government to pressure Bear Shearing to meet the cost of these funds. I also hope that the German government take responsibility for their collusion in keeping Duganon, which is Primados, on the market, and act compassionately to compensate the German victims. An apology would be meaningless without an admittance of guilt, both by the government health agencies and Bear Shearing, who continue even today to deny an association with congenital abnormalities on hormone pregnancy tests. I would like to conclude by thanking the many members of the scientific community for their invaluable support, with special mention of Neil Vargason, Carl Hennigan, Jesse Olshenko-Grin, John Abrahams and Tim Lewins. Heartfelt thanks also to our wonderful, indomitable members who motivate me by their unfaltering support and consistent encouragement. To Yasmin Qureshi, Chair of the APPG, and the many MPs who supported the members of the association and their constituents. To members of the review team, who treated our members with compassion and empathy during the patient representative meetings held this year. And last but certainly not least, to my husband Mike, without whose unwavering support I would not have been able to continue with this campaign. Thank you.
Well, Mary, thank you so much. That was very clear, very concise, and well put, so thank you very much. We haven't got very long, but Mary, can I just ask you, and it's helpful you're setting out the history of all this, and of course it's gone on for a very long time, as you pointed out to us today, and in your written submissions, and I'd like to thank you for those. But it's always moving forward, and I just wondered, this year we've had further information that's come through the EMA, and I wondered if you had any views on that. And this is about the Brown paper. Yeah. Any thoughts on that?
The review for the EMA was actually initiated, I think, by the MHRA. I didn't have any particular surprise at the results, as I didn't have any particular surprise at the results of the MHRA zebrafish review. What I did find strange was that I was in that fish review and I listened to the evidence. What was evident when they actually gave the conclusions was that they had not actually acknowledged some of the positive, a lot of the positive remarks made by the scientists in that room. They had not acknowledged that it was actually an indication of harm to humans, and that filtered through then to the EMA report. Again, it's as I said in my initial submission, you won't find any medical health regulatory agency finding any association whatsoever. One, because they won't acknowledge the evidence, and two, because they don't actually look for it.
Right, thank you very much. Okay. Right. So, is there any questions you'd like to ask? Simon, anything you'd like to ask?
Well, I mean, Mary, first of all, thank you very much, and to Daniel and Nicky as well for such eloquent testimony. There's so much to go over, as Julia says. This is a story that's been complicated and lengthy, and you've lived through it to such an enormous extent. I suppose you've touched on this already, but what are your top priorities for what should happen next? If you had to say to us, there's one thing above all else that we should focus on, is there something of that nature, and what is it?
Absolutely. The first thing that I would hope is that the science is finally recognised. That's imperative for us, for the mums, because that then will, assuage some of the guilt that we took the tablet. That is essential. There has to be recognition at long last that there were huge amounts of scientific evidence available. So the fact that now we have the additional evidence from two very reputable scientists, I would like to hope would once and for all find that yes, there is a possible association. And again, it's how that's looked at with some associations. They don't want to look for that. When you look at the Uppsala recommendations, it does actually meet. The second thing would be that in some way or other, Bayer shearings are contacted, that it should be a government-based contact, because there is equal responsibility both from our regulators and from the executives of Bayer shearing. That then, I would hope, would get a response in relation to how can we solve this? How can we actually make sure that people like Daniel, people like Nicky, all our other members actually receive the redress which they need. Number one, to actually enable them to continue with independent living, and number two, to acknowledge the suffering of many of the mums. That they've actually, again, in the 60s and 70s, they're actually still looking after children of 40, 50 years of age who are incontinent, blind, can't speak. That's a huge burden. That burden will actually end up being passed on to siblings. So it's never ending, and it will never end until the science is acknowledged. That's the most important thing. I think it's wrong that we have to look for the science to be acknowledged first, but that seems to be the way that the government want it to be.
Everything flows from that.
I mean, when you say the science will be acknowledged, what are you sort of meaning by that?
That there will be, that once the meta-analysis was completed by Carl Hennigan, and he found independently, and I must stress that there was an association, and that was, it's as simple as that. In fact, it says there is an association between congenital abnormalities and HPTs. Once that's acknowledged, I really don't see how it can then go back to there isn't an association. Initially, we were asked to look for a possible association. That's already there in the expert working group report. And if you look at all those studies, the forest plot graphs, every single one found a significant association. So my feeling is, and this was there back then, that was there in the early days. But again, my frustration is it's always science first, which I appreciate if there was no evidence. With the evidence we have, I actually think it's about time that was acknowledged.
Anything else? Well, thank you so much, and thank you very much, all of you, for coming today, and also your observers. Very, very grateful. And
we know you shall.
If you've got further questions you want to ask us, please do. We want to keep in touch with all the patient groups. And we may come back to you if there's clarification that we need.